In this video, I want to go a bit further into the subject of unequally yoked. I've spoken about being unequally yoked before. If you haven't watched those videos, watch them. I'm going to repeat a few things and then I'm going further. What does it mean to be unequally yoked? First things first, what is being yoked? What does it mean? A yoke in a social setting is a shared responsibility that people have towards one another. If you have a corporation, all the people that work in that corporation, including the managers and the bosses, they have a shared responsibility to make the corporation work. That means they ought to look after each other's safety and each other's productivity. If you have a village, then the people in that village have a shared responsibility towards one another. Yes, each is responsible for their own contribution, but they are responsible for each other in that community. So if you have an elderly woman who has remained in her house for days, someone should check out what's going on with her. Is she all right? So that's what it means to be yoked. A yoke is a shared responsibility. And in every human community, you have shared responsibilities. Because there must be empathy towards one another for any human community to remain safe. So a yoke implies empathy. A yoke implies responsibility. It implies obligations. It also implies privileges. It implies rights. That's what a yoke is. So when you have a situation when things work out well and everyone is looked after, then you have a healthy yoke. But if you have a situation in which there is no proper balance and there is no proper regulation concerning the expectations and obligation in the community, then you have an unequal yoke. Okay, let's say now you have a restaurant and the owner of the restaurant expects his staff to work to their best to please the customers. Now the mission of the restaurant is to serve the customer quality food. Okay, that's obvious. For this to work, the chefs must comply, the cleaners must comply, the waitresses must comply, also the managers must comply. Everyone, including the boss, the owner, needs to comply to make this mission work. But let's say now you are the chef, you arrive there, but there are mice everywhere, the cockroaches here and there, the fridge doesn't work well, so you can't function properly as a chef because there's no hygiene. And you know very well that every meal you make will harm the customer because it's not safe. And your boss doesn't want to hear anything. He just wants you to do your job. And here's the worst part. You're not paid well. You're not paid enough. Because you don't have any other job at the moment, you're stuck there. What's going on here? You're being exploited. You're being used for an unjust purpose. So you are being tricked in injustice. So this is an unequal yoke. The boss demands from you, but he doesn't want any obligations concerning his own demands. So all the weight must come on the chefs and the staff, and the boss wants all the benefits, but he doesn't want to hear anything else. That's an unequal yoke, and that's even a dangerous situation. If you have a marriage in which one of the marriage partners demands everything, and the other partner has to just comply and get along, that's an unequal yoke right over there. Right over there. Or let's take it a bit bigger. Let's say you have a society and you have minorities in a society. And those minorities are exploited and trampled upon. Yet the majority doesn't want to face it. That's an unequal yoke right over there. So an unequal yoke is an unjust, let me say this, an unequal yoke is an unjust context in which there is one party that gets most of the benefits at expense of the other parties. Now, the New Testament makes plain that believers shouldn't be unequally yoked with unbelievers. to some extent, believers are yoked with unbelievers because we're part of human communities. We have unbelievers at the workplace, amongst our relatives, at the supermarket, or if you take if you take a plane to another country, the flight attendant may be an unbeliever or the pilot. So we are involved with unbelievers whether we want it or not. That because we're alive, we're part of the human community. Christ hasn't returned yet, so there are unbelievers amongst us. Not all unbelievers are reprobates, but we have unbelievers amongst us. So we cannot say we don't want anything to do with unbelievers. We have to deal with unbelievers. That's practical. However, we shouldn't be unequally yoked with unbelievers. And in the New Testament, as a side statement, it's written, what does light has in common with darkness? There's nowhere written that believers shouldn't be unequally yoked with other believers, because believers have the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit will act as a correction agent when we go astray. So it's not possible to be unequally yoked with other believers. Believers amongst believers can only be equally yoked. They can only be justly yoked with one another because we have the Holy Spirit to be relying on. That is, if you're dealing with believers. When it comes to unbelievers, they don't have the Holy Spirit. They have no spiritual basis. That's why unbelievers, when they want some spiritual aid, what they have left is a paranormal, which is a counterfeit to the real. So it comes down to this. Common people, they have no spiritual foundation. They don't. Because they have no spiritual foundation, they seek strength into external structures. This is idolatry. So commoners are rooted in idolatry. That means that you will have to deal with them in daily life, but don't get too involved with them. Because commoners, when it comes down to it, they will prefer unequal yokes instead of facing the truth. Now there are commoners that face things and they look for help, and eventually those end up with Christ. But commoners in general, they don't want to face things. They can't handle frustration. They can't handle any challenge. I'm telling you. Just a question for you now. Something for you to think about. How come there is so much sexual molestation of children going on worldwide? It doesn't matter which country you're in. It doesn't matter which ethnicity. Sexual abuse of children is a common thing. And I'm not talking about those that worship Apollo and who rape kids in darkroom rituals. I'm not talking about them. That's institutionalized. We know that happens. I'm talking about amongst commoners, where you have relatives abusing one of their minor relatives. Or in organizations where people work together, where they tend to take advantage of the weaker ones. Why is this such a common thing? And here's another weird thing about this whole sexual abuse of children. When the victims at a later age speak out, others, that means strangers who hear the testimony, are often shocked that nobody knew what's going on. But here's one thing I want to reveal onto you. There are times sexual abuse of children happens and people are not aware of it. That happens. It's a sad thing, but happens. But in most cases, people know what was going on. People know it was happening. They just didn't want to address it. Because to address it would mean they need to face things. And because the community or the people around didn't want to face things, they tolerated it. Let me give an illustration to you. You have Bethany. She's married to Frank, okay? And Frank is upset. Why? Because Frank has expectations concerning Bethany that don't add up. Frank doesn't want to do anything in the household, but he still wants to have a peaceful house. That's not going to work. There's going to be conflict. And Bethany does her best to address the selfishness of her husband, but her husband doesn't want to take it. So eventually there is conflict that lingers around, and because of this there is dysfunction in their sexual consummation of one another. And this leads to more frustration in the household. But one day that husband thought it was a good idea to lay his hands on his niece. Now the wife was not aware that he was doing this. The wife did realize that suddenly his behavior changed. He was more relaxed. He didn't change his behavior. He didn't change his attitude, his selfish attitude, but he was more relaxed. So the wife thought things were going well. But the wife did notice that he talked often about his niece. He didn't do that before. So the wife realized something is wrong here. And the wife realized that despite that they weren't having sex that often, he was at ease. Well, normally he would complain all the time. So the wife realized, okay, is he cheating? What's going on there? There were red flags that something was wrong. And within a half year, that niece of theirs had behavior problems at school. So the parents often had to come to school because she would often be in fights, she would argue, she would be aggressive, she would be violent. She wasn't like that before. So when all of this data was revealed, when she was exposed to all of this, it should have gone through to her that her husband is doing something to the niece. That's the obvious conclusion. But Bethany didn't want to think about it. She just wanted to be left alone. She was a married woman. She got validation from the community for being a married woman. She had invested emotionally in the relationship, so she didn't want to challenge it. She didn't want any challenge. And there were people around that also noticed that something was wrong, but they wanted to mind their own business. As society tells them, mind your own business or stay in your own lane, they wanted validation and approval from society, so they didn't interfere. In this case, there is a victim, that niece, and her life is now messed up. As an adult, she has all kinds of issues. She doesn't understand why. And she's likely to develop a drug addiction or alcohol addiction, all kinds of other troubles. She's likely to become the prey of sexual predators at an older age also. Who caused all of this? That husband, Frank. But he's not the only guilty party. The wife, who noticed something was wrong, should have intervened. Or if it was necessary to leave the husband, should have done that. The environment, the community around that knows something was wrong, should also have looked into the case and intervene if needed. Instead, they all chose to ignore it. And even at the school where the niece was escalating, the teacher should have realized something's terribly wrong here. But they also wanted to mind their own business. So now you have a whole pack of cowards that enable the situation. Now, there are unbelievers who are really against this. There are. But in general, unbelievers tend to put up with such stuff. It doesn't have to be sexual molestation of children. It can be other stuff. It can be it can be child abuse in general. That's one thing that commoners often tolerate. It can be exploitation of the poor, or it can be all kinds of stuff. Commoners, to keep the fake peace, to keep the ease in their communities or better in society, they will put up with evil. They will hide evil. They will hide it under the carpet, figuratively speaking. That becomes their yoke, to keep the community at ease at all costs. That's injustice. That's unjust. So as a believer, to be at ease and to be at peace with such folks implies that you need to get along and you need to be involved in their injustice. And once you become involved in their injustice, evil spirits become attached to you. So now you become demonically infested also. That's why scripture tells us, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. It goes deeper than just different opinions. Common folks tolerate many crimes just to receive acceptance and a pat of the back by society. Think of the example I just gave unto you of the dysfunctional marriage where eventually the husband preys on his niece. And think of the school that doesn't intervene. Think about other relatives that know that something's wrong but they don't open their mouth. Such things are common in the world. Or better said, in most cases, it's the rule in the world. It happens on the workplace. It happens in high school. It happens in college. It happens in churches. It happens in public. Now look, I do not recommend you to just intervene whenever you see something wrong. Because you need to check the context. I made another video in which I explained to beware with doing what's right. Sometimes a situation may appear one way, but it's something else. And even if it's some way, your safety matters also. So it's not meant for you to just endanger yourself by intervening. No, I'm not saying that. But at least you can acknowledge something's wrong, and if needed, you draw attention of others to it, or you report it to the proper institution or to the proper people. Commoners are unequally yoked with one another quite often. And as a believer, you either participate in that same unequal yoke, or they often turn on you. And even when you comply and you become unequally yoked with them, because you have the Holy Spirit, because you have options that they don't have, they'll turn on you anyway. Often you will become the causality amongst them. I'm telling you as it is. Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. A more remarkable thing is that warlocks and to some extent witches, or let me just say pagans. Pagans were not believers. Pagans who don't have the Holy Spirit, pagans who don't follow Christ, they understand this far better than believers do. Pagans don't have their own books stating this. Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers, because they're not believers. So they can't have this statement. But pagans do understand that being unequally yoked will bring harm in the long run. It is for this reason that pagans prefer to only deal with other pagans. I mentioned before, warlocks in general can't stand witches because witches tend to be quite dysfunctional. Because they think they can do it without men. But nevertheless, even though warlocks can be fed up with witches, they'll put up with witches anyway because witches have a common basis in paganism like they do. Because of that, they can always keep the witch in check when necessary. They know that with common women, if you try to keep them in check, they may get out of line and things may escalate. Pagans understand the danger of being unequally yoked far better than believers do. It shouldn't be like this. That's why I'm informing you now. Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. If you have a believer that persists in the negative, then you should treat him as an unbeliever. He's not an unbeliever, but you should treat him as an unbeliever. Because he or she is unequally yoked with unbelievers. So you treat him as an unbeliever as long as he's unequally yoked. You will have to deal with other people, also unbelievers, in daily life. There's nothing wrong with that. Just don't be unequally yoked with folks. If you notice that an unequal yoke is developing, get out. If you have a job, I'm not telling you to quit your job and lose your house because you can't pay the rent. I'm not telling you to do that. But when you notice that the unequal yoke is developing, remain in prayer, act against it. I'll better said overrule it. But when you notice that the unequal yoke will remain, try to look for another job or try to lower your hours at the workplace, because listen, anytime there's an unequal yoke and you participate in it, you are bringing demonic infestation upon yourself. You attract harm, you attract disease, you attract all kinds of stuff. Don't do that. Well, that's it for now. Remain in agreement with Christ and be at